I met my wife over a decade ago, and we spent almost 10 years together, 7 of those as a married couple. We have 2 children, both grown now, living their own lives. Our first encounter was on a blind date, and if I'm honest, the whole night was nothing short of awkward. She's a beautiful woman with an outgoing, lively personality, the type who can effortlessly light up a room. Me? I'm more of the quiet type, definitely not the kind of guy who turns heads. I mean, I'm not an eyesore, but I'm not about to break any hearts either. I've always been reserved, while my wife has always been the one people gravitated toward at parties or events. She's got this strange ability to make everyone feel seen, always so kind-hearted and empathetic, looking for the good in people. It was almost baffling to me that she was even interested in someone like me. Yet, somehow, she was, and before I knew it, our relationship blossomed into something real. Eventually, we tied the knot and began building a life together. And honestly, things were good, really good. We had a comfortable home, stable finances, supportive families, and a solid group of friends. Our kids were thriving too. It was one of those lives you don't think can go wrong. But, as is often the case, something came along and flipped everything upside down. For us, it all started with a pregnancy. We already had 2 kids at the time, and we both wanted one more, hoping to expand our family. Our intimacy was never an issue, so it wasn't long before we had baby number 3 on the way. When my wife told me she was pregnant, I was over the moon. We kept the news to ourselves for the first 3 months, waiting for the right moment to tell our families. During that time, we were caught up in the excitement, planning the nursery, preparing the kids, and making sure our finances were in order. Then came the worst day of my life. I'll never forget the phone call from my wife, her voice shaking as she told me, "Something's wrong." I rushed her to the hospital, but it was too late. At 6 months along, we lost the baby. The devastation was unimaginable. The drive home the next day was suffocatingly silent. I couldn't find the words, and neither could she. When we got home, my wife went straight to bed, and she didn't leave that room for 3 days. The grief and depression were all-consuming for her. What hit me hardest was that she believed she'd let me down, that she'd failed as a wife. No matter how many times I reassured her that it wasn't her fault, that it was simply beyond our control, she couldn't let go of the guilt. For months, she stayed trapped in that dark place. It took her about 6 months to start coming out of it, to show signs of being her old self again. Things seemed to be getting back on track. We were both focused on the kids, she was laughing more, and we even started talking about the future. She threw herself into exercising, working hard to get back in shape. And let me tell you, she looked incredible. I made sure to remind her of that, too, showering her with compliments and telling her how much I loved her. Around this time, my wife brought up the idea of getting a part-time job. It wasn't about needing more money, we were doing fine in that department. She just wanted something to occupy her time, a way to stay active and break out of the monotony of being at home. She felt like she needed a change of pace. I thought it was a solid idea and told her she should go for it if that's what she wanted. It'd be good for her to have something to do outside the house, something just for herself. I figured she might look for something in line with her degree. She has a business background, after all. But to my surprise, she ended up getting a job as a waitress and bartender at a restaurant just a few minutes from our house. I wasn't expecting that at all. With her qualifications, she could have easily gone for something more professional, but she explained that she wasn't looking for a career shift. She didn't want the pressure of a 9-to-5 job and all the responsibilities that came with it. She said that juggling work, the house, and the kids would be too much. This gig at the restaurant would be flexible, keep her on her feet, and give her a chance to earn some extra money without getting overwhelmed. Plus, she said it was important for her to get out and interact with adults again. After months of being at home, she was feeling isolated, and this job was her way of reconnecting with the world. She needed to feel like she was contributing more than just being a stay-at-home mom. I understood that. So once again, I gave her my full support and told her to go ahead with it. Now, like I mentioned earlier, my wife has always been an attractive woman, but at this point, she was looking better than ever. She'd been working out, losing weight, and really taking care of herself. I could tell she was proud of how she looked, and she had every reason to be. She's naturally curvy, and she knows how to carry herself in a way that grabs attention. Men have always noticed her, but I never had any reason to worry. She'd always been devoted to me, and I never had a shred of doubt about her loyalty. I trusted her completely. When she started working at the restaurant, things seemed to be going smoothly. She worked 2 or 3 nights a week, mostly on weekends. I did start to notice, though, that her work outfits were, well, let's just say they were attention-grabbing. She wore clothes that really showed off her figure, nothing inappropriate, but they were definitely designed to highlight her curves. I'll admit, it made me a bit uneasy. I wished she'd tone it down a little, maybe dress a bit more conservatively, especially with the kinds of guys who tend to hang around bars. When I brought it up, she just laughed and told me that dressing like that helped her earn better tips. She even joked that maybe her outfits would light a fire under me and make me more interested. I laughed it off at the time, but deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't entirely comfortable with the whole situation. The restaurant owner was a decent guy. He ran a respectable business and seemed to treat his staff well. His whole family worked there too, so it felt like a tight-knit operation. But then there was his son. He was a different story altogether. The guy was a classic rich kid, born into money and completely aware of it. He didn't bother hiding his privileged lifestyle and acted like he was above everyone else. He was around the same age as my wife, and I'll be honest, he was a pretty good-looking guy, fit, well-groomed, and charming in that cocky way some women seem to like. But his arrogance was off the charts. He was married, though he and his wife didn't have any kids yet. His wife, by the way, was a genuinely kind person. She worked at the restaurant too, handling the bookkeeping. She seemed down-to-earth and hard-working, a real contrast to her husband. The son was supposed to manage catering and special events, but from what I gathered, he was lazy and regularly dumped his responsibilities onto his family or coworkers. He preferred to spend his time working out at the gym, cruising around in his fancy car, and bragging about his so-called success with women. Honestly, the guy made me sick. From the moment I met him, I could tell he was all talk, just a blowhard who thought the world revolved around him. I couldn't, for the life of me, understand how his wife put up with him. My wife, however, mentioned him to me a few times. She admitted that, while he was undeniably good-looking in that bad boy kind of way, he was a real piece of work. She found him arrogant and insufferable, but she had to keep things professional at work. She told me she didn't like him but tolerated him because she didn't want to stir up trouble. That made sense at first. I mean, who doesn't deal with difficult coworkers from time to time? But as the weeks went by, I started noticing that she was talking about him more often. It wasn't anything major at first, just little comments here and there about how they worked together or how he'd crack jokes at the bar. Then, I saw that they seemed to be getting friendlier. I wasn't exactly thrilled about that development, but I didn't make a big deal out of it. Still, something in my gut didn't sit right. I told her flat out, that guy is trouble. You need to watch yourself around him. She brushed it off, saying I had nothing to worry about. During the next several months my wife did begin to act peculiar. She kept a close eye on her phone, claimed she had to work late, and began to be absent for long periods of time claiming that she was shopping or was running errands. She also began to ignore me to some extent, and I also thought she was not as attentive to the kids as she had been in the past. My wife is a good mother, but she seemed to be impatient at this time and had no concern with turning over more of the responsibilities to me. It was a challenge since I also work full-time and am the primary breadwinner of the family. I did tell her of my concern, but she told me things were going okay and I was seeing problems where there were not any. One night my wife and I were alone, and it was fairly late. I made a move on her, and she shut me down cold. I asked her what the problem was, and with that she started crying and shaking. I asked her what the problem was and then received the shock of my life. My wife told she had been seeing the owner's son for almost 6 months, the relationship had turned sexual, she loved him, we were done, and she was going to leave me to move in with him. She also told me that she had been deeply unhappy since the miscarriage and felt that something in our marriage had died. She needed a fresh start and she needed to be free to live her life. She also told me that she loved this guy, and he could make her happy. I was obviously pretty shook up and asked her to reconsider. She told me it was too late for that and would be moving in with her new boyfriend into an apartment they had secured. I asked her about the kids, and she told me that it would be best if they stayed with me in the house to maintain a good home and she would be there to see them. It is an understatement to say that I was absolutely shocked and flabbergasted at what had taken place. My wife told me that she did not understand the surprise since she thought I was well aware of her unhappiness with our marriage and the miscarriage had been the final nail in the proverbial coffin. I was not pleased when I learned who she had a relationship with. It is one thing to get the complete shafting from your wife and another to find out she was ditching you for a guy who was really a dirtbag. I do not want to make a generality, but there does seem to be some truth that so many women are attracted to guys like this. I am not sure if it was his looks, flashy lifestyle, or his big mouth. But she apparently was interested in him and it took off from there. I was also shocked that she had been involved with him for 6 months without my knowing. They apparently had been having sex in his car, the restaurant, hotels, his house, our home when nobody was there, etc. It was a real betrayal, and I was deeply hurt. But I thought about what I would do and maintained my perspective and composure. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of tears, endless arguments, and frankly, just a lot of emotional chaos. My family, particularly my dad, was livid. He didn't hold back his disgust, spewing venomous remarks about my wife every chance he got. He felt personally betrayed, like her actions had disgraced our entire family. On the other hand, her family was upset, too, but they didn't seem to carry the same level of bitterness or outright hostility that mine did. Still, the tension was there, like an unspoken battle line had been drawn between both sides. I actually had to step in and tell my father to dial it back. As much as I appreciated his support, I reminded him that she was still the mother of his grandchildren. We were all going to have to figure out a way to coexist, for the kids' sake. No matter how angry or hurt I was, I didn't want to create more negativity for our children. My dad surprised me when he nodded and told me he respected how I was handling the whole mess. He said he was proud of me for not letting the rage consume me. I told him it wasn't easy, and it wasn't. Believe me, I had every reason to want to lash out, to make her feel the kind of pain she had put me through. But after a lot of soul-searching, I knew revenge wasn't going to get me anywhere. She was the mother of my kids, and at the end of the day, that meant I had to maintain some level of civility for them. I had to take the high road, even if deep down, I wanted to be the biggest SOB on the planet. In hindsight, I'm convinced I made the right call, though there were days when it tested every ounce of patience I had. After several painful weeks of back and forths, pleading, and tears, she finally moved out. She packed up her things and went to live in the apartment she had secured with that guy. I'm not going to lie, it felt like a gut punch watching her go, but at least it marked the beginning of the end of this chapter. She still tried to stay involved with the kids, visiting them and attempting to be part of their lives. It was awkward, to say the least, but I could see she was trying, in her own way. Meanwhile, I felt an odd sort of sympathy for the guy's wife, who was completely blindsided by this whole ordeal. She was mortified by everything that had happened, and not long after, she quit working at the restaurant and found another job. She even filed for divorce, which didn't come as a surprise. Every now and then, I'd run into her at the grocery store. We'd exchange brief pleasantries, and I always wished her well. It was hard not to feel sorry for her. She didn't deserve any of this. I heard through the grapevine that she eventually moved back to Pennsylvania, remarried, and started a family of her own. By all accounts, she's now living a happy life, with kids and a solid man by her side. I'm genuinely happy for her. Her getting away from that jerk was probably the best thing that could have happened. In hindsight, it was almost like life gave her a second chance. The divorce itself was surprisingly smooth, all things considered. There was some back and forth about splitting assets, but it wasn't anything dramatic. She got her share, and I agreed to pay alimony for a short period, 6 months, if I remember correctly. Honestly, I would have paid more if it meant speeding up the process and getting this chapter of my life over with. At the end of the day, it felt like a small price to pay for my freedom and peace of mind. We settled on joint custody, though I retained primary custody of the kids. She didn't make much money from her part-time job, but she did contribute a small child support payment each month. To her credit, she never missed a payment, and she did what she could to remain in the kids' lives, even if it wasn't as much as I'd hoped. I can't help but believe that what she went through, the miscarriage, the depression, triggered something deep inside her. I don't think the woman I married, the woman I had loved for all those years, would have ever gone down this path under normal circumstances. She was going through some kind of personal crisis, no doubt about it. And as much as I wanted to blame myself, I knew there was nothing I could have done to stop it. It was out of my control. The miscarriage had taken a toll on both of us, but for her, it was a tipping point. Then came the day we signed the divorce papers. It was surreal, to say the least. I met her at her attorney's office, and there we were, after nearly a decade of marriage, after raising kids and sharing a life together, sitting across from each other, waiting to sign our names and officially call it quits. It was all very civil, but man, it was tough. What hit me the hardest was how happy she seemed. She walked in with that same guy, the one who had blown up our marriage, and she almost looked giddy, as if she were finally getting what she wanted all along. She smiled and laughed, and for a moment, I couldn't believe what I was seeing. This was the woman I had spent years of my life with, the mother of my children, and yet here she was, acting like this was some kind of joyous occasion. That stung more than I can put into words. It was the only time during the entire divorce process that I felt truly disrespected by her. But what was I going to do? There was nothing left to fight for. The marriage was dead, and I had to accept that. It was time to move on. As hard as it was to walk out of that office, I knew it was the start of a new chapter. One without her. And strangely, that brought me a bit of peace. When I signed the papers, I caught a flicker of something in her eyes. Maybe it was regret or just a brief moment of self-awareness. There was a look of shock, and I'm sure she hadn't expected me to say what I did. But I had thought about it for days, carefully planning how I wanted to close that chapter of our lives. It wasn't easy, but I wanted to leave with some dignity and maybe even give her something to think about. I'm no actor, but on that day, I had my lines ready, and I delivered them exactly as I'd practiced. I'm obviously sad about this, I began, looking straight at her. I thought we had a good life and that we were a solid team. I'm sorry if you feel I failed you, and I couldn't give you the happiness you were looking for. Maybe you thought someone else could offer you a better chance at that. I also think the miscarriage played a bigger role in all of this than we realize. Tragedies like that can either bring people closer together or tear them apart. It's ironic that what should have been a joyful experience for us is what ultimately drove us apart. But that's in the past now. I genuinely hope you find the happiness you're seeking. Let's work together to give our kids the happiest, most stable life we can. When I finished, the room was thick with silence. Her face had gone stark white, and in that moment, I saw the regret in her eyes, clear as day. It was like she hadn't expected me to be so calm, or maybe she realized what she had lost. I stood up, shook her hand, and wished her well. I turned to her attorney, who said he'd send me a copy of the finalized divorce papers. And with that, it was over. For a while, things seemed to go smoothly enough. She was living with this guy, playing house, but soon enough, cracks began to show in their so-called exciting relationship. It didn't take long for the shine to wear off. I started hearing through mutual acquaintances that he drank too much, was still relying on his family for everything, and wasn't contributing much to their household. He was exactly what I'd thought, shiftless and immature, far from the man she thought she was getting. Apparently, he also had a wandering eye, already making moves on a younger woman who worked at another restaurant his family owned. It was strange, but I continued to order food from the original restaurant, partly out of convenience and partly out of habit. Every time I walked in, the owner would greet me, and I could tell he was embarrassed. He never said it outright, but his face said it all. He was ashamed of his son's behavior. It must have been tough for him to watch this unfold. His son had not only ruined his own marriage but also left a path of destruction in mine. I could tell that the owner, a man who clearly valued family, couldn't understand where things had gone wrong with his son. Once, he even told me as much. There was an unspoken camaraderie between us, both feeling betrayed in our own ways by the same person. I never lingered when I picked up my food. That would have been too awkward, especially knowing my ex-wife still worked there. Meanwhile, her fantasy life with this guy was unraveling fast. The fights between them were becoming more frequent, and it wasn't long before reality hit her hard. Whatever excitement or passion she thought she had found with him was fading, and she was left with the harsh truth: she had traded in a stable, committed relationship for someone who wasn't capable of giving her the same. I think she started to realize that life with me, while not glamorous, was steady. I had always put her and the kids first. I was reliable, someone who had built a life for us, not just talked about it. She started calling me more often, usually under the pretense of discussing the kids, but our conversations would drift. She'd start lamenting about her life with him, how things weren't what she'd imagined. I remember one particular phone call where she said, "I've made a huge mistake." She told me how she felt trapped, how he wasn't the man she thought he was, how everything seemed to be falling apart. But I couldn't be that person for her anymore. As much as a part of me wanted to comfort her, to be the person she could lean on, I knew I had to draw a line. I told her plainly, "I'm not the person you should be talking to about this." She hesitated, and then she reminded me how I'd always been her best friend, the one she could talk to about anything. I told her that was true once, but things had changed. We weren't married anymore. I wasn't her husband or her confidant. I told her she needed to work things out with her new partner, that I wasn't comfortable being dragged into her relationship problems. There was a pause, and I could hear the hurt in her voice when she quietly agreed. I think that moment stung her, realizing that the safety net she once had in me was gone. I wasn't going to be her sounding board anymore. She had made her choices, and now she had to live with them. When she hung up, I felt a mix of emotions: sadness, relief, and maybe a bit of validation. In some strange way, I think she was starting to realize that maybe I wasn't such a bad option after all. But by then, it was too late. One night, my kids were staying over at my ex-wife's apartment for a movie night and sleepover. Her dirtbag boyfriend was there too, and I had some unease about the whole situation, but I trusted that she wouldn't let anything bad happen. That trust quickly shattered when I received a distressed call from her later that evening. Her voice was shaky, and I could hear the panic as she explained what had happened. Apparently, this guy had been drinking, frustrated that the kids weren't interested in watching one of his shows. I didn't catch what the show was, but it didn't matter. The kids were clearly disinterested, and that set him off. Things escalated when my youngest daughter said something he didn't like, and in a fit of anger, he slapped her hard across the face, leaving a mark. As soon as I got that call, I didn't think twice. I rushed over there. My mind raced with anger, and I had half a mind to call the cops. I probably should have. But in that moment, my priority was getting my kids out of that toxic situation as quickly as possible. I stormed in, saw the fear on my kids' faces, and immediately gathered them up. I wasn't about to let them spend another minute in that apartment. Before I left, I turned to him and told him in no uncertain terms that if I ever heard of something like this happening again, my next call would be to the police, and he wouldn't just be dealing with me anymore. He'd have the law to reckon with. I'll admit, there was a certain satisfaction in the next thing I said to my ex-wife, though. As I gathered my kids, I looked her straight in the eye and said, "So, this is what you left me for?" She didn't respond, but the look of shame on her face said it all. She hung her head, and for the first time, I think she truly realized the magnitude of her choices. Later that night, just as I was starting to calm down from the whirlwind of emotions, there was a knock at my door. I opened it to find her standing there, tears streaming down her face, looking more broken than I'd ever seen her. She was sobbing uncontrollably, and through her tears, she told me that she had broken up with the guy and didn't know what to do. She asked if she could come home. For a few moments, I just stood there, processing everything. Part of me wanted to tell her to come back. After all, we had history, and she was the mother of my children. But another part of me knew that too much had happened, too many wounds had been opened. After thinking long and hard, I told her that I loved her and always would, but I couldn't let her come back. I explained that with everything that had taken place, there were just too many painful memories tied to our past. Letting her return wouldn't fix anything, it would only reopen old wounds. She was devastated, but I wasn't about to let her be stranded. I let her come inside to calm down and offered her a place to call her parents. Once she had spoken to them, I drove her over to their house. When we arrived, her father met me at the door, and for the first time in a long while, I saw a sense of relief in his eyes. He thanked me for looking after his daughter and for putting the kids' safety first. His words meant a lot, and he even told me that I had always been a good husband and a good man, even in the face of everything that had happened. I told him something that came straight from my heart: would always love his daughter. Things hadn't turned out the way any of us wanted, but I would never let harm come to her, no matter what. To this day, I'm proud of how I handled that night, protecting my kids and, in a way, still looking out for her. She ended up living at her parents' house for about a year. During that time, she got back on her feet. She found a good job and eventually moved into her own place. Her spark slowly returned, and I could see glimpses of the woman I had once known. Although things between us were never going to be the same, she remained a good mother to our kids. It was a strange new normal, but at least there was stability. Over time, she had a string of relationships, none of which seemed to work out. I think she got taken advantage of more than once, and it pained me to see that. On several occasions, she would confide in me, saying I was the best relationship she'd ever had, that no one else could compare. Maybe it was just words, something she said to ease her own guilt, but I have to admit, I liked hearing it. Despite those words, nothing romantic ever happened between us again. We maintained a cordial, respectful relationship for the sake of our children. Looking back, I know I could have taken her back if I had wanted to, but I just couldn't do it. There was a part of me that longed for it, that missed the idea of us as a family, but the fear of being hurt again was too strong. I had been through enough, and I wasn't willing to risk reopening those scars. During that time, I dated a few women, but none of the relationships ever became serious. Several of them wanted more, but I was just too cautious. My focus was on my work and my kids. I had no desire for another marriage or a long-term relationship. The memories of my marriage, both good and bad, were still too fresh. Going solo seemed like the best path for me, at least for the time being. I had built a life around my kids and my responsibilities, and in the end, that was enough. The years flew by in what felt like the blink of an eye. My kids grew up, did well for themselves, attended college, and launched good careers. They got married, started families, and carved out lives of their own, something I couldn't be prouder of. Family events became a constant, and of course, my ex-wife and I would cross paths regularly at birthdays, weddings, holidays, and the like. Every time we met, it was familiar, but there was always this underlying tension. She would often ask me if I was seeing anyone, a question I had grown accustomed to. Then, inevitably, the conversation would steer towards whether there was still a chance for us. Could we get back together? Could we reclaim what we once had? My answer was always the same: no. Some things stick with you, and no matter how many years pass, some scars never fade completely. It wasn't out of bitterness, but more out of a sense of finality. I had made my peace, moved on, and tried not to dwell on the past. But she hadn't. Over the years, she confided in me more than once that leaving me was the worst decision of her life, a mistake she regretted deeply. She told me there wasn't a single day that passed when she didn't wonder, what if she had stayed? What if we had worked through the miscarriage and the pain, instead of letting it break us? Her regret was palpable, and I could see it in her eyes, hear it in her voice. Family gatherings, particularly big events like weddings and birthday parties, were always hard for her, she said. She told me the hardest moments of all were at her parents' funerals. She had been devastated by their loss, but even more so by the fact that I was there, yet not by her side as her husband and partner. She said it struck her hardest at the weddings of both our children. Those should have been joyous occasions we shared as a couple, as a united front. Instead, she felt alone, looking across the room at the man she had once loved and who had been a good husband and father, but no longer her partner. I understood her pain, but when she asked if I ever felt the same regret, I was honest. I told her, yes, it had been sad, but I chose to move forward, to live without constantly looking back at the past. I had learned to accept what had happened, whereas she was still weighed down by it, haunted by the choices she made. Her regret seemed ironic to me at times, given how certain she had been all those years ago that her true happiness lay with someone else. She had been so sure of her decision to leave, only to spend a lifetime wishing she had stayed. It was a tough thing to witness, and though I didn't hold it against her, it was clear that her journey had been far more painful than mine. Now, pushing 60, I found myself reflecting on life, love, and the future. I was thinking about retiring, maybe moving somewhere warmer, at least for the winter months. The idea of slowing down, enjoying some peace and quiet, and soaking up the sun was appealing. My kids supported the idea, and though they loved their mother dearly, they understood that it was time for me to start living for myself again. The last time I saw my ex-wife before the move was at a birthday party for one of our grandchildren. It was a cheerful event, but there was a heaviness in the air between us. At one point, she pulled me aside, asking if we could talk alone. We stepped outside, and as soon as we did, I could see the emotion welling up in her. She was clearly struggling, and it didn't take long before she broke down. Through her tears, she confessed that she had always thought there was a chance, some sliver of hope, that we would find our way back to each other. But now, with me preparing to move away, that hope was slipping away for good. She told me that my leaving would be the final nail in the coffin of her regret, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she had failed, not just as a wife, but as a partner to the one person who had truly cared for her. Her words were hard to hear, but I stayed composed. I told her she shouldn't feel that way, that too much time had passed, and we had both done our best with the hand we were dealt. I made it clear that I still held respect and admiration for her, despite everything that had happened. She then asked me something that caught me off guard, if she could come visit me, once I had moved. I wasn't sure how to respond at first. The thought of it, after all these years, stirred up old feelings I hadn't quite confronted. Every time I looked into her eyes, especially her beautiful green eyes, I felt my heart soften, no matter how much I had tried to guard it. On this particular day, she looked more beautiful than I had ever remembered. The years had been kind to her, and despite everything, the love I had once felt for her came rushing back, stronger than I had expected. I had loved her deeply once, and that love hadn't entirely disappeared. In that moment, standing there with her, I realized something. Perhaps I would welcome the idea of having a relationship with her again, not in the way it once was, but in a new chapter of our lives. I wasn't interested in getting remarried, but at this stage in life, what did I have to lose? She had made me happy once, and in many ways, my love for her had never completely gone away. Maybe now, after all these years, we could find a way forward together, not to relive the past, but to create something new. As we parted that day, I promised her I would think about her request to visit. And as I watched her walk away, I couldn't help but wonder if perhaps the next chapter of my life might just include her after all. I've been living in the Carolinas for the winter, enjoying the warm weather and a slower pace of life. To my surprise, my ex-wife did come to see me after all. It felt surreal at first, like stepping into an old memory, but the moment she arrived, it was clear that the feelings we once shared had never really disappeared. All those emotions, the connection, and even the chemistry, it was all still there, waiting beneath the surface. She stayed with me at my place, and we spent a lot of time together, rekindling that old bond. We visited the beach, went out for dinners, and took long walks. I could tell she was happy, more at peace than I had seen her in years. The weekend she was supposed to spend with me stretched into 2 weeks, and then into a month. We fell into a rhythm, a familiarity that was both comforting and exciting at the same time. One evening, we were sitting on the porch after dinner, enjoying the stillness of the night, when she broke down. She started to cry, deeply and uncontrollably, as all the pain and regret from years ago came rushing back. Through her tears, she confessed that these past few weeks had brought her more happiness than she had known in a long time, but the joy was shadowed by guilt. She told me she was so sorry for what had happened between us, and that she spent much of her life wondering, what if she had wasted so many years chasing some idealized version of happiness that didn't exist. A happiness she thought she could find elsewhere, but now realized was a mirage. I listened quietly, and then I told her what I had come to realize too. The past is behind us. I told her that maybe it was time to let go of the pain and consider what a future together might look like. I reminded her that I had always loved her, and despite everything, my feelings had never really gone away. I asked her if she would consider staying with me, not just for a visit, but permanently. I was clear, I wasn't looking to get married again. At this point in our lives, I didn't think marriage made much of a difference. What mattered was that we were happy, that we were together. She agreed. In fact, she never ended up leaving my home. Things have been going wonderfully ever since. When we told the kids, their reactions were priceless, complete shock, but mixed with genuine happiness for us. My youngest daughter, though, told me privately that she wasn't really surprised. She had always sensed that my love for her mother had never truly died, and deep down, she had a feeling that things between us were never really over. I know some people reading this might think I'm crazy for giving this another try after so many years, after everything that happened. But here's the thing, at this stage in life, all that matters to me is love and respect. The past, with all its heartache and mistakes, is behind us. When I look at my wife now, and yes, I still consider her my wife, despite the years we spent apart, I only feel love and affection. There's no bitterness left, no resentment. Just love, and a deep sense of peace. I believe that our best years are still ahead of us, even as we head into old age. Sure, she made a terrible decision all those years ago, but I'm not holding on to that anymore. We've both faced the consequences of our choices, and we've come out the other side stronger. I look forward to the life we still have ahead, and I'm grateful for this second chance we've been given. It may sound hokey, but one of the things that always stayed with me over the years was the feeling that we had been writing a book together, and that it was left unfinished. I was deeply saddened by the thought that we would never get a chance to finish it. But now, I'm thrilled to say that we're picking up the pen again, and together we'll write those final chapters. Will my wife cheat again? I don't think so. Not at this stage in our lives. But I've learned that people are complicated. We all have good and bad within us, and no single action defines who we are. I have regrets of my own. My biggest regret is that I let hurt feelings dictate my choices after the divorce. Perhaps I should have recognized that she, like all of us, is a human being who made a mistake. Maybe if I had been willing to give us another shot earlier, things might have been different. I think about the what-ifs, too, but I'm choosing not to dwell on them. Instead, I'm focusing on this incredible second chance we've been given. We're back together, and that's all that matters. And with that, I'll conclude. I hope that in sharing my story, maybe it offers some perspective to those of you reading it. Life is full of twists and turns, but sometimes, if you're lucky, you get a chance to rewrite the ending.